Good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation this evening. If this is your first time with the Gotham Center for New York City History, I invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find nearly 1,000 articles, hundreds of podcasts and recorded events, and on all things New York City history. Those of you interested in our online classes can also check out gothamed.org to find out more about those. This is an event we have been waiting for several years now. We are so excited to be welcoming our guest tonight, Ross Perlin, the author of this amazing new book, Language City: The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York. We have a sold-out show tonight, and I do not want to take any time away from our speakers, so I'm going to just briefly introduce them and then hand the floor over to our guest tonight and our discussant. Ross Perlin is a linguist, writer, translator here in New York City, co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, which you'll hear much more about this evening, I'm sure. Where since 2013, he's been documenting and mapping endangered languages around the world from their office in Manhattan, with a personal focus in his own research on Himalayan tongues. A PhD in linguistics from the University of Bern in Switzerland. Perlin also teaches linguistics at Columbia University. He has published in the New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's, numerous other places, lectured widely, made numerous TV, radio appearances, translated several books, primarily from Chinese into English, and most recently was a fellow at the New America Foundation. He was also, a couple of years ago, working on this book that we'll be discussing this evening, a Robert D. L. Gardner Foundation Fellow at the Gotham Center here at CUNY's Graduate School. So I want to note our benefactors in that program and thank them for producing this amazing work that we'll be discussing this evening. Our interviewer who'll be leading us in conversation is Nancy Foner, herself a highly, highly distinguished professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate School of the City University of New York, the author or editor of 20 books, 2 more on the way apparently, focused mainly on immigration, and more than 120 articles and book chapters. She is the winner of countless prizes. I could not possibly name them all, and served on numerous prestigious national academic committees and elected to several distinguished national honor societies. So I'm very delighted that she could join us in conversation tonight as well. I'm going to turn things over to Ross now, who's going to lead us with a quick overview of the book. The usual housekeeping, the chat function is disabled out of respect to our speakers. So if you do have any comments to make, you're going to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. I invite you to submit questions during any point in the next hour or so of conversation. At 7:30, we will begin taking those questions, and I'll send you some reminders as we go along. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ross Perlin to tell us about this fantastic new work.
Thank you so much, Peter. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you all for coming. I'm so excited to be here to be talking about a book which came out just last week. So this is totally fresh, and it's the culmination of a decade of work in sort of various fields that we'll talk about. But thank you for coming. Thank you to the Gotham Center for playing a crucial role in the making of this book. Actually, as Peter said, I a couple of years ago was a Gardner Fellow at the Gotham Center, and as somebody trained in linguistics who maybe had a sideline in New York City history and born and raised in the city and read everything I could, it was still my first chance to actually be meeting with, interfacing with, and kind of understanding the world, the remarkable world of New York City historians. And to have the time and space through the Gardner Fellowship for a year to really work on this. Key parts of the book were researched and written during that time. So I really owe it to the Gotham Center and to Peter and for this opportunity. And I'm grateful to be in conversation with Nancy, who has literally written the book on immigration. I should say the 20 books, but on every aspect. Immigration is also something that I, had some understanding of, but was not trained in, not an expert, but have started to see it and understand it from a linguistic point of view as, as such a central kind of factor in the rise and fall of languages, the mobility of people, the peopling of New York. So I'm really excited for this conversation and also for all the questions from all of you. I thought I would just, for a couple of minutes, kind of give a brief overview of what I think are some of the sort of the main points of the book, the structure of the book, things that I hope you'll be able to explore as you read it. This is about the most linguistically diverse city, not just in the world, but in the history of the world, contemporary New York. We've always known it was diverse, of course. That goes without saying. It's a much commented fact about the city. But the depth of that diversity has increased exponentially in recent decades, and our understanding of it really only goes back, I would say, a decade or so, through the work of the Endangered Language Alliance, where I'm co-director, but connected to a sort of extended family. It's a small nonprofit, but there are, hundreds of linguists, language activists, speakers, and others who've come through our doors who have contributed their knowledge. And especially relevant here is our mapping effort, which hopefully some have seen. It's the results are now kind of freely, openly available on languagemap.nyc. It's really the first ever language map of a city. It shows over 700 different languages that are spoken at, what are shown as over 1,200 different sites around the metropolitan area, but focused on the city. And of course, in some ways, focused really on the outer boroughs. This is very much a story of the outer boroughs, famously of Queens, of course, which is now known as the world's borough and has become the epicenter of post-1965 migration. But just as much in parts of Brooklyn, parts of Staten Island, the Bronx, and indeed even parts of Manhattan, and now suburbs and other parts of the metropolitan area. And although I'm excited for a New York focus, and the book is deeply, I hope, wrapped up in the city, this is also about what's happening to cities worldwide and the sort of intersection of languages and cities, and especially of primarily oral, endangered, minority, and indigenous languages of cities that are coming into cities. The world has over 7,000 languages, according to linguists. It's hard to say sometimes what's a language, what's a dialect. If we were to talk about dialects, we'd be talking about many, many more, tens of thousands, innumerable. But in terms of languages, there's broad agreement that there are over 7,000, that linguistic diversity is highly threatened today, that as many as half of those languages are now spoken by fewer than 10,000 people and are highly endangered. Most of those languages have traditionally been oral. Writing is a relatively recent technology of pretty small elites for just a small number of languages, although of course now it's spreading, and part of our work as an organization is sometimes wrapped up in helping groups that want to begin writing their languages to do so, which has a lot of interesting complexities to it as well. But the story of New York and cities is something relatively more recent. Urbanization, of course, is a major fact of our time. New York gets its start. We could sort of get into the history, as a Lenape-speaking archipelago. Lenape itself is something of a paradigm case of an endangered language, which we can talk about. There's a section of the book. It's one of the 6 languages that's in focus. It's the original language of not just New York City, but of the surrounding area. And now really is down to 1 speaker in Canada, and then a group of revivalists, of whom I profile one. And she was bringing the language back to New York for the first time in centuries, with classes here at our office on 18th Street. What follows in the book is a linguistic history of New York. So beginning with Lenape, and then this sort of Dutch entrepot that comes up in the early 17th century that itself is totally unusual compared to the other 13 colonies, and is multilingual from the very beginning, 18 languages reported among just several hundred people. We're now in the 400th anniversary of that colonial founding under the Dutch. And really the template is set then, and New York is multilingual from the very beginning. But the nature of that multilingualism changes substantially. And I try to trace that through the book through 4 separate sections, which look, first at this sort of minority port of minority peoples, especially from different parts of Europe, who for various reasons are religious refugees, are economic fortune seekers, come to this city. And then we see, the growth of an indigenous metropolis in the early 20th century. We see communities of survivors of enslavement, of genocide, of various tragedies finding refuge in New York. It's a major theme in the city's history in which such groups are always overrepresented compared to majority groups. And then I talk about the emergence of the city post-1965 as a global microcosm, where it's not an exact representation of the world's languages by any means, but increasingly languages from all over the world, and especially certain major linguistic hotspots, indigenous parts of America, the Himalaya, West Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, are increasingly bringing their languages here and increasing the diversity exponentially. The meat of the book, though, the heart of it really are in the stories of 6 speakers. And I hope these are, engaging and bring it to life, the languages and the people, those who speak them in a much richer way. So we'll probably touch on those as Nancy and I talk, but there are 6 speakers from different parts of the world bringing different languages in different ways to the city. And these are people I've worked with for years. And, those stories are, I think, bring it alive, hopefully, the sort of contemporary picture. And then briefly, I close with a sort of questions about the future. Where are we going to go from here? Is this peak diversity? Will New York or any other city ever be this linguistically diverse again? What are we doing or what are we not doing to document, support, hold, understand, map that diversity? So that's a brief précis, but I'm excited now to go into questions with Nancy, and then we'll have questions with everyone else. So Nancy, take it away.
Here I come. Hi. Thanks so much for that answer, and for inviting me to talk about your book, right? It's a wonderful book. It's really fascinating. It's important. It's extremely well written. I think you can already sort of get a sense of that from listening to Ross. And it's focused, as you can also hear, about immigration and endangered languages in New York. And the book is filled with fascinating facts, details, often very surprising. One of them that you've just heard is that New York is home to over 700 languages. I mean, that is a pretty astounding fact, and that's today. I just wanted to give just 2 other examples from the book, and they're sort of random, but they struck me as I was reading it. One is that I had wondered why most of the Sherpa from Nepal in New York, who are a group of among the newest arrivals, share the last name Sherpa. Some of you in the audience may know that too, because many Sherpa drive taxi cabs. And when you get into a taxi cab, I've seen many of the drivers, their last name is Sherpa. And I was always wondering, I knew they were Sherpa, but I didn't know why their last name was Sherpa until I read Ross's book, which said that it's because the Nepal government directed everyone to take last names en masse based on their ethnic group. So that was one fact that I learned. Another one, it's not New York City, but it's close by and goes further back, that I learned a surprising fact about Sojourner Truth, a former enslaved woman born in upstate New York at the end of the 1700s, and she became a very famous advocate for the abolition of slavery. And I now know that she was a native speaker of Dutch, which I found really surprising because she was very famous for her oratory in English. In fact, she's become a kind of iconic figure of late. But in addition to these many, many fascinating facts and details, the book raises very important questions about language among immigrants, including about language loss, which we've heard about and already we begin to touch on, but also language change and language invention and the creation of new mixtures. So it's got a lot of material about language and immigration. The major theme of the book and the reality of New York are disappearing immigrant languages. That's stressed throughout the book. But I want to emphasize at the outset here, just in my very brief comments, how innovative this topic is and the approach and research in the book. Because in the world of social sciences, I'm a sociologist, as you've heard, and I come from the social sciences, and I'm also an immigration scholar. When we talk about immigrants and language in the social sciences, The concern is not endangered mother tongues among immigrants. In fact, that's hardly mentioned ever. The concern, in fact, is whether are immigrants assimilating? Are they learning English? And particularly in light of popular fears in the U.S. that immigration, it may lead to, the disappearance or the not such a having English not having such a primary role. In fact, certain states, of course, passed English only legislation, and so this has led social scientists to try to understand, well, what's happening when immigrants come in terms of their learning English, not their native, and so that's been the focus. And this model of linguistic assimilation has really dominated social science discussions of languages. The first generation, both today and in the past, coming not speaking English, although many immigrants today already come speaking English, make some progress with English, but they're usually more comfortable with their and fluent in their native languages. Is not we can understand because they grew up in another country or another place with another language. The vast majority of the US born children of immigrants are fluent in English, although many of them are bilingual. And then by the third generation, which is the grandchildren of immigrants, they are to a large extent monolingual English speakers. So that's the trend among immigrants, their children, and their grandchildren, which has been the focus of the social science literature, but not on endangered languages that immigrants are bringing with them when they arrive. And so to get back to start off our discussion and pose some questions to Ross, to go back to the perspective of endangered immigrant languages to get our conversation going. So let me just ask, why are so many languages spoken in New York disappearing? Okay, so that's to open our discussion.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, I guess to say a brief word also about what the lens of language hopefully can bring to these questions. I think there is a tendency to look at immigration and immigrants through the lens of nationality. That's what the statistics kind of show us. That's what the data is recording, right? And that's kind of also, that may be how people present themselves. It might be relatively understandable. As I mentioned, we're talking about over 7,000 languages in the world, but there are only about 200 nation states. Most of those nation states are quite recent creations for various reasons, really in just the last century or so. The languages we're talking about go back, you can't sort of date a language, but we're talking about reflections of historical processes going back hundreds or thousands of years. And I think a closer look at how immigrants themselves self-identify and organize the kinds of institutions they set up, especially when they first arrive. Things like the hometown associations, of which there are thousands in New York and have been thousands for a long time of different kinds that reflect the specific places, the specific towns and regions in people's own terms that they're from. You'll see that identities, local identities, linguistic identities, or ethno-linguistic identities are actually much deeper, richer, and tell us a lot more about where people are coming from than just to talk in terms of nation. And if we're talking historically, before most of the nation states were around, it's also anachronistic to speak in terms of nations. We really need to specify that the first permanent settlers here coming from Europe were speakers of Walloon. It's not really helpful to say, oh, they were from the French-Belgian border, because Belgium didn't really exist in its current form until over 200 years later. And even today, when you're talking about trying to really understand where people are coming from, it's not necessarily helpful to say, oh, so many people are coming from Mexico. Well, 70 to 80% of them are coming from Puebla and Guerrero, two particular states in the South. And those states are actually heavily indigenous and have large numbers of speakers of languages like Mixtec and Nahuatl and so on. So I hope that the lens of language actually sort of highlights, what immigration scholars have known and have seen in different ways, but the very specific ties that people have to certain places and identities. And then I think there's this, as a result of that, it's also, a general thing that I've observed, especially in terms of languages, that it's people from the sort of more minority or marginalized groups and languages historically who have come to New York, who have had the reason to immigrate. They've been fleeing various kinds of tragedies. They've been fleeing marginalization within wherever they are. And so what you see time and again is that, the particular groups of people, whether it was during the Great Famine in Ireland, it was disproportionately Irish speakers coming from Western Ireland versus, well-off people coming from Dublin, or, whether it was even today, it's that those who are coming and seeking asylum are often speakers of the non-national languages. They may also be highly multilingual and speak the national languages, and that's often kind of what's seen as well. But I think, part of the answer to the question is that it's actually specifically from highly diverse places and from sort of more minority and refugee and marginalized communities that people have the impetus to come here.
I think that's partly true. Although one of the things that we find in immigration studies is that migration is highly selective. And actually, the more ambitious often leave. And a high percentage of current day immigrants actually are quite highly educated, right? In New York, it's about a third. In the country, it's a whole. So, I mean, many do come with who are educated. Obviously, the places that immigrants come from are important, not just the national origin. Although what's interesting, I think, often in New York or in the United States, is that people become perhaps more conscious of their national identity than they often might have been in their home country, because they took it for granted. And it wasn't so important, it was something they just took it for granted. But now, and also when they come here, people identify them as coming from a particular country. And so that begins to affect, and maybe they interact more with people from not just their village or their local region, but they begin to interact with people from other parts of their country. So they become more aware, they develop new identities in New York. I guess it's interesting to hear that tied up with languages. Yeah.
It has a very strong linguistic dimension, what you're saying. I mean, there are people who are, Quechua speakers from Ecuador or Mixtec speakers from Mexico who are actually learning Spanish when they come here. And certainly the idea of, say, a Latino identity is something that they would be finding here, actually. And so I think both national and so-called pan-ethnic identities actually come into play when people come here, and they find a city that's patterned in terms of ethnic blocks, and where political power and access to resources, something that you've highlighted in your work, Nancy, the role of schools, right? And who your classmates are, especially in the sort of the world of the second generation, as you've called it. People are sort of finding new identities. Yeah. And I think that's part of what I hope to highlight in the book is a sort of a city of multiple assimilations, and that it's actually not just this idea that people are sort of heading straight towards a sort of an American English-speaking identity, but actually when you first land in Jackson Heights, it may be more important to sort of sharpen your Hindi or your Nepali or your Tibetan, and to sort of know how to move within a South Asian world. Or if you're a Fujianese immigrant coming to Flushing, you're going to be using a lot of Mandarin instead of Fujianese potentially, but you also have access to a large Fujianese world. And the issue of English often comes later. There are, a dozen languages in the city that have close to 100,000 speakers and that have a massive presence in different neighborhoods.
Although the push to English is often there too, if only because it's helpful in the labor market and getting along in New York.
Push to English is pretty much there as well.
Yeah. I mean, that'll maybe, I have the order, but maybe since you raised the Mexican case, because I thought that was an interesting one about your discussion of Nahuatl, and which is the language spoken by some people in the Mixtec regions of Mexico, which is in the center. And many of the Mexican immigrants coming to New York are from that region. Not all, they're coming from other places too. But if you look at where Mexicans go in the United States, we get in New York a lot from Puebla and from other parts of that region. And on the one hand, you write about a revival of interest in Nahuatl, which is an indigenous language among some immigrants from the Mixtec region. Yet on the other hand, you also say there's pressure to improve or learn Spanish in New York, as well as linguistic assimilation towards Spanish already happening in Mexico, right? Because they probably, a lot of them know Spanish. And in fact, I like this kind of notion, which is, I noticed that you cite Leslie Martinez, I was on her dissertation committee. And she talks about how becoming American in some cases is learning to speak Spanish. Yeah, because they're living in Spanish-speaking communities, so they have to, yeah. And you note that many at the same time are just using the indigenous language in very limited settings, for example, on the phone when they talk to relatives in the home country. So I guess my question really is, to the extent that there's what you call an indigenous awakening across the city with regard to indigenous Mexican languages, how extensive do you think that is? And how much is it related to what's going on in New York? How much is related to what's happening in Mexico? I don't know, just to throw that out, because it's a very interesting case, obviously.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's many, many ways to kind of approach this. On the one hand, there is a sort of global indigenous awakening since the 1960s. The term indigenous, sort of articulations of indigeneity, identification as Native American on the census, right, continues to increase, to a large extent. A lot of that is also the so-called Hispanic and Native American. So a fascinating thing to kind of understand that I talk about a little bit is that something like 70% of New Yorkers who identify as Native American also identify as Hispanic. That's at least one kind of sort of clue that then sort of a linguistic understanding also kind of helps us understand how indigenous identities differ from country to country, depending on the history of colonialism, the impact of Spanish. Unlike in North America, especially in the US, the formerly 300 or so native languages that were spoken north of the Rio Grande are now, for the most part, highly endangered. But the languages in Mexico and in Ecuador and in some of the places that people are coming from to New York, some of these languages are still spoken by large numbers. So Nahuatl is the most widely spoken indigenous language of Mexico, spoken by something like 1.5 million people. It's where the name Mexico comes from. Every word of Mexican cuisine you've ever heard of, and I talk about this because I profile Irwin, a Mexican chef who speaks Nahuatl and who cooks with the sort of Nahuatl etymologies in his mind. So for him, the meaning of taco, the meaning of mole, the meaning of guacamole, the meaning of all of these terms, actually, these are Nahuatl terms, and that's how he kind of understands it. This was the language of the Aztecs. This was the language through which the Spanish themselves sort of had to rule initially. There is a written tradition, especially kind of in, not much is known about it during the Aztec period, what the writing was, but there was some kind of writing, and now there is a way of writing it in Latin letters that was pioneered under the Spanish. So there has been in Mexico itself since the 1990s a whole kind of sea change that is, again, part of this global sort of movement that has been bolstered with legislation that recognizes indigenous languages, some amount of teaching of indigenous languages at different levels and support in certain ways. So to some extent, we're talking about developments that are happening, between Mexico and New York, or as the case may be with sort of Quechua awakening, developments in both the Andes and in New York that are happening sort of in tandem. But what's happened in New York specifically in the last couple of decades is that the migration from these places has been disproportionately indigenous. And so you now have, you have large numbers of people who are coming from a Quechua speaking background in Ecuador or a Nahuatl or Mixtec speaking background. And on the one hand, there is still a great deal of internalized shame around those languages, and they're primarily oral. So there's not, there aren't spaces as much or signage or media in maybe some of the ways that one might expect. But it does track with the pattern for so many other indigenous languages around the world, which were primarily oral, that they're used more in private spaces, or that there's a shift happening, but people still, are people maybe speaking in a mixed way. But the sort of indigenous awakening specifically that I talk about in the book that Nancy is referring to, I think really is just in the last decade or so. We're seeing organizing efforts. We're seeing it here at the Endangered Language Alliance. We're seeing the first kind of organizations and institutions that kind of reflect people from indigenous backgrounds. We're seeing a sort of workers' rights movement, especially around the delivery workers, the deliveristas, who are heavily indigenous. There's a sort of occupational niche, and these were essential workers who were especially vulnerable kind of during the pandemic. So it's coming from sort of different directions. We were contacted as an organization by the Department of Health and other city agencies to produce materials in these languages for the first time, recognizing that these are, some of the most vulnerable New Yorkers, but that also there's a great need. As Guatemalan New York increases, those are, mostly speakers of Mayan languages who are coming. Certain countries like Guatemala and Bolivia are heavily indigenous. So it's really it's a major change in the nature of the Latino world in New York. Certainly there is Spanish as a lingua franca for many of these groups as they're sort of shifting towards it. But the native language backgrounds, these are substantial and important. And I think there is it is a major change in the city.
Interesting. Another group I was interested in reading about is one that is closer to my own research interests in the past, which is you talk about new Creoles in the book. And that related to the people from what I guess we could call the English speaking Caribbean, right? Which is where I started out doing my research, right? So I actually did field work in Jamaica. I wasn't looking at language, but in fact, it was, I always thought that when I went to this village in Jamaica, this is an aside, I thought, oh, I'm going to a place where everyone speaks English. And then, of course, I couldn't understand what anyone was saying because they were speaking they would slow down when they spoke to me. But when they spoke quickly in patois, it was very hard to understand. I was somewhat shocked. So, but if you put together all the immigrants from the English-speaking Caribbean in New York, they actually are the largest immigrant group in New York. And you write about how a new super language is what you call it in your book, a kind of common Caribbean English Creole may be developing in New York. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about this. And I also wondered, and maybe I'm off base here, so you can tell me if I'm wrong, does this resemble in any way the way Italian developed among immigrants from different regions in the past? Maybe it's different, but I just wanted to throw that out. Maybe you could think about it. But I thought it was interesting to see that New York is a place where something new is developing. Well, I think it's also developing among other communities, but here they're actually creating a new kind of Creole or mixture in New York.
What linguists call language contact, speakers of different languages coming into contact with each other, extreme levels of multilingualism. It's not uncommon for many New Yorkers to command 3, 4, 5, 6 languages without any formal education in them. These are some of the most fascinating things that are going on linguistically in New York. It's not just that the odd person here or there is speaking a rare language that hasn't much been documented, like the languages we're talking about. It's that people are intensely multilingual. And what they're doing, they're mixing and they're code switching. And in the case of Creoles, people talk often about a sort of Creole continuum. What Nancy is talking about, sort of an ability to go from sort of highly informal Jamaican patois that might be totally incomprehensible to an American English speaker, but to then kind of, to be able to go many different levels on that and to sort of, go all the way up to sort of formal British or American sounding English, or all kinds of levels in between. The Caribbean world in New York is an extraordinary one, I think, without any clear parallel. You have people from every single island here, basically, speaking every kind of Creole. Even if we're just talking about the sort of English-based Creoles, because there's also the French-based Creoles, and there's also there's also the question of indigenous languages of the Caribbean too, especially Garifuna, which sort of originates in the Caribbean and then sort of goes to Central America. But just in terms of this Caribbean English, what you have here, and this is true, well, we can talk about this for other cases, is people from all these different islands who are now living on the same block in Flatbush, right? Or they're in the same, square mile in Canarsie. And they may be now marrying each other, having kids with each other, working with each other. So here's a Bajan guy speaking Bajan Creole. Here's a Jamaican patois speaker. Here's a Trini guy speaking, the Trinidad Creole. And it's tricky here because there are some common origins here. These Creoles emerge in the Caribbean through the nature of plantation slavery and the large scale kind of demographic things that were happening, but they had different local articulations. Each island there were some differences, but then what happens when they all sort of come back together and are in contact with each other? And I think I'm not enough of an expert on these Creoles to say exactly what the mechanisms are, but I think there is evidence that what's happening in New York when they're all sort of up against each other is that sort of new forms emerge, sometimes what is called leveling, which is that, sort of there's a certain convergence towards a simpler form, or one form kind of that is more widely used kind of takes over others, or a couple of forms combine. But this is arguably what happens a little bit also when every form of Spanish comes to one place. It's also what happens when, all these Himalayan languages come to a few square miles of Queens. So there are sort of new forms here. And sometimes we use words like, when we're talking just about the code switching, there are terms like Spanglish or Runglish, the sort of Russian English mix, or Yeshivish, which is, the sort of mixture of Yiddish and English and Hebrew Aramaic that you see in Orthodox communities in Brooklyn. But these are distinctive. The city is an important site for these. It's not necessarily the only site, but a crucial site for them, because you have the sort of density and contact between people who are now kind of, coming up against each other and are mixing. So it's fascinating to see these new forms kind of taking shape. And I talk about that a little in the book.
And then maybe you could speak a little bit about Italian, because I don't know if everybody knows about the Italian case, which is very interesting, right?
The Italian case is super complicated unto itself too, and I think reflects a lot of these themes. And I think it is a good parallel with some of these other contemporary examples. So, the vast, this is one of the largest quote unquote Italian speaking cities outside of Italy. But actually, what has Italian meant in the history of New York? When the first sort of large waves of immigrants were coming from the Italian peninsula, Italy had just been unified, and Standard Italian, which is based on the Tuscan variety, was really spoken by a very tiny percentage of the population. And most people were coming from southern Italy, from particular places, the poorer places, the more marginalized places, speaking varieties of Sicilian, speaking varieties of Neapolitan, Calabrese, and so on. And those differed really, and still do in some places, from village to village. I mean, that's the degree of linguistic diversity that you have in the Italian peninsula. And there's a lot of pride in those local identities and a lot of connection to local ways of speaking, even if they are related in terms of, the larger kind of Italo-Romance group. So then again, what happens when everybody comes to Little Italy, comes to Bensonhurst and the Bronx? You have a really complex situation where, on the one hand, certain older forms or older dialects are actually preserved in some ways that they're not in Italy, because in Italy you see a sort of the sweeping in of Standard Italian over the course of the 20th century. But then you also see these forms of mixing. You see a kind of what some have called a sort of Southern Italian koine, a koine being a kind of common language that people converge on. So something where sort of different Sicilian and speakers of different Sicilian Neapolitan varieties kind of found a way to communicate with each other. You see, people again, kind of as with the Creoles, kind of being able to sort of shift depending on who they're talking to and what the situation is. And then, of course, you see Standard Italian coming in over time. But you see all these different kind of levels of language depending on the context, and really sort of creative and sort of challenging things that are very hard to document or study, but are like speed of light facts on, the streets of Queens.
Very interesting. And then we have to discuss Yiddish, which you spent time talking about. And of course, it's something that I have a personal connection to. Not that I speak Yiddish, but two of my grandparents, on one side, my grandparents actually spoke and read Yiddish. And I should say, just as I was actually sent as a child to a very left-wing Yiddish shul, we called it, Sundays. It was on Sundays when I was a child. Although, unlike you, I have no my linguistic skills were very poor, even as a child. And I never learned to speak and write it. Every year we sort of started at the same point and then started all over again the next year. And in fact, my father used to joke that what I learned in Yiddish school was that Harriet Tubman was the Moses of her people, which is about what I learned. But it is a fascinating case because it collapsed globally, as you say in the book. But it's now being revived in a new way in New York. Indeed, you write that the largest number of Yiddish speakers in the world now live in Brooklyn, which is incredible, right? So the question is, I have a bunch of questions I'll throw out and then we can discuss. So how and why did Yiddish collapse globally? And in New York City, when in the 1920s and 30s, some 10 million people in the world spoke Yiddish. And how, why, and when has it been revived and reborn as a Hasidic language in Brooklyn? In fact, you say it's becoming even stronger now than it had been in pre-World War II Europe. What's going on here? What's sustaining Hasidic Yiddish now? So maybe you could tell us a bit about the story of Yiddish and its rebirth in Brooklyn in this new way.
So Yiddish was also in my family. I heard many words, as many Jewish New Yorkers have. We're mixed in into sort of a bit of a Jewish English. But then I learned the language as an adult and sort of worked to find the world of secular Yiddish and to some extent the world of Hasidic Yiddish in New York at a sort of pivotal turning point where it's gone from being famously one of the sort of oldest languages associated with people in their 70s and 80s to being one of the youngest languages, where actually it seems in New York now close to half of all speakers are under 18. So this is
wow,
a
really?
language. So it is and it isn't an endangered language, or forms of it are endangered. And I tell the story of Yiddish through what I hope is a sort of a new and intriguing angle, which is a portrait of a guy named Boris Sandler, who was an editor for 17 years of the Yiddish Vorwärts, which in its sort of last days came from Moldova, in one of the last places where non-Hasidic kids were being raised in Yiddish in the 1940s after the Holocaust. Came to Brooklyn. He was educated in the Soviet Union. And is still writing novels in Yiddish. But the story of Yiddish, I think, sort of illustrates a number of things in the book, but also kind of, complicates the story, hopefully, in rich ways. Because on the one hand, it's clearly one of the major languages of New York City history. It was the major language of that wave of Eastern European Jews, some 2 million of whom came between 1882 and sort of the closing of the door in 1924. And that made New York the world capital of Yiddish, with the most Yiddish speakers of any place. It also got Yiddish sort of away from some of the restrictions and pressures in Eastern Europe, such that Yiddish theater, Yiddish journalism, Yiddish poetry flourished here as never before and never since. Indeed, at that moment in the 1920s and 30s, New York was sort of the capital of a diaspora of Yiddish, which had no homeland, obviously, but New York was had become the nerve center of it. And, what happened is that it all kind of collapsed. Part of it had to do with immigration restriction that happened after 1924. Then the Holocaust really results in the loss of probably half of all Yiddish speakers. And then you have pressures everywhere. The remaining groups of Yiddish speakers who are in Israel and the Soviet Union, elsewhere, are all under different kinds of pressure to stop speaking, to shift to those national languages, Hebrew, Russian. And in the US, likewise, the pressure to shift to English, the desire to shift to English. New York, the dynamics of New York, the next generation. Yiddish burned very brightly for that sort of 1 or 2 generations among that generation of migrants. It's still, it left all kinds of intriguing and substantial pockets, and there were some families that carried it on. It had an impact on English and so on. But this is where it's really important to understand the dynamics of different waves of migration and who's coming with what backgrounds in what ways. Because even though Yiddish remains important through the 20th century and even plays a role with the arrival of Soviet Jews who had some Yiddish background, what really sort of turns it around for Yiddish, but also transforms the situation, is the arrival of surviving Hasidic groups after the Holocaust, especially the Satmar. And they reestablished themselves in Brooklyn after the war with a strong mandate and desire to carry on in Yiddish and to maintain their distinctiveness. And so that 3-generation pattern that Nancy mentioned, which is so common, where the language is often lost by the 3rd generation, and where New York is just this kind of sieve that languages are running through, despite being the most linguistically diverse place, it's always sort of losing the languages. Now for Hasidic Yiddish, you have it going into the 4th and 5th generations. Some of it is certainly demographic. The community itself, with its high birth rate, is just increasing exponentially. And of course, religiosity and sort of community solidarity play a role. But what I would highlight is the role of community institutions, having a separate education system, having an ambulance service, having media, having a whole set of institutions that are functioning entirely in Yiddish is really sort of allowing people to I think yes, I mean, there's engagement with English, and there are complex dynamics, gender dynamics, where women may speak more English and so on. But there's really been a decision to maintain Yiddish, and it sort of shows the possibilities of language maintenance and language revival. And it's not even necessarily a sort of ideology about Yiddish. It's actually just sort of Yiddish has become the symbol of distinctiveness. It's the language of the martyrs who died in the Holocaust. It's the language of the Rebbes, who are the community leaders. And so what's happening now is kind of extraordinary. It's an extraordinary case of language revitalization, which in many ways is sort of an interesting counterpoint to the revival of Hebrew in Israel. But we'll see what happens now. It's really been fundamentally nurtured in Brooklyn. It's a different kind of Yiddish in certain ways.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. So it's again, it has to do with where people were coming from. The Satmar were coming from sort of what's now Hungary, Romania, speaking what's called Southern Yiddish, which is quite different from kind of a Lithuanian Yiddish, different again from Ukrainian Yiddish. So some of those varieties of Yiddish are endangered, but what the Hasidim speak, which is sort of the Southern Yiddish, which actually is now changing in New York, again, like the Italian or Caribbean examples, because you have all these Hasidic dynasties, which used to be in totally different places, are now together in the same, part of Borough Park. You actually have a sort of a new mixture with influence from English and Hebrew and so on. So it's kind of a new language in some ways, Hasidic Yiddish. It doesn't have those literary or secular components. Obviously, it's shot through with more of the religiosity, but it's an extraordinary kind of linguistic story that, again, is part of this, of Language City.
Yeah, it's interesting because you were mentioning, I was thinking of, factors that lead to the sustenance of revival or maintenance of these religions. So you mentioned hometown associations in the book. You talk about rotating credit associations or networks and ethnic enclaves that bring people together and the community, and so they're interacting with each other in many different settings. But I also, the Yiddish case also raises the maintenance of transnational ties, if we want to call them that, right? Because those were cut off in the past, right, for Jews with the Holocaust. I mean, right, their relatives were killed, and they weren't maintaining ties with the home country anymore, right? Whereas I wonder, to what extent that's operating among many, other groups in New York, and that their maintenance of or the perpetuation of their home of these languages, one of the 700 is enabled by continued connections with the home country, is also, an issue.
Yeah. These
and
kinds
political ties too.
Right. These kinds of transnational ties, as the term is often used in kind of scholarship, are vital, right? They're a key part of what makes the immigrant city tick. And what I hope I've done in the book, I mean, we're talking about these themes and these issues, but I try to show through the 6 characters, the 6 speakers and their communities, how these actually function on a granular level, what it really is like to be in one of these kind of savings associations where people are pooling money so that if you need money for a surgery or a house or whatever, you can get it even if you're not connected with a bank. You get it from the people who speak your language, who are from your village. So I hope I kind of show these sorts of ties at a really granular level. I mean, yeah, they play a huge role in language maintenance, and language maintenance is kind of very much tied up in them. With the Sherpa community, for instance, there are, busy Sherpa taxi drivers in New York who may actually be paying a fellow Sherpa back in Nepal to say certain prayers or perform certain rituals because they have more time and they're close to the home and so on. These ties are daily and constant for some people, and there are arguments that they've kind of deepened and accelerated through the internet and through a lot of it is WeChat and WhatsApp and FaceTime, plane travel being easier. For many groups, there is more back and forth. There has always been some amount of back and forth for many groups, but there are huge differences, as you're saying, in terms of how much people are able to maintain those ties. And if it's a case, as it was with Yiddish speakers, where a whole world is cut off, then you're sort of on your own. You have to rebuild it in New York. For other groups, there is a constant back and forth. There's continuing flows of immigration that may replenish the language so that it seems like there are always speakers. There are, why do people come to New York? Well, New York has these, it's a great first stop, at least for people, because they have people who speak their language. They have some of these institutions there. So, I think this is what really tries to, brings the immigrant city alive, are these ties, and that people are connected to things going on 7,000 miles away. One of the cases I talk about in terms of Himalayan languages is Seke, a language with 700 speakers, basically at most in the world, from 5 villages in Nepal, and basically a couple of buildings in Brooklyn, these vertical villages where, as many as a quarter or a third of those speakers have now kind of come to those places. The fate of the language and our attempts to document it, which I talk about in the book, going between Nepal and Brooklyn. You have to go to both places. You need both places. It's really, it's a story that links them and links us to all these parts of the world. So I hope that's part of what people take away, that New York is kind of at the center of a web that connects all these different places, many of which, people may not have heard of, but they're the places that sustain us. They're the places we're connected to. We should know the names of places like Bialystok or Tlapa in Mexico, or Cibao in Dominican Republic. These places are deeply connected to this. They're part of what makes New York, New York. And New York, in turn, deeply shapes those places. You'll see, Yankees hats and houses built with New York remittances, places where everybody has relatives who are in New York. That's really a sort of a deeper kind of global impact and a sort of secret web that connects us.
So I guess we could come to some of the future questions, because it seems like the immigrants are coming to New York. They're maintaining ties, many of them with their home country. They're bringing these languages with them. But of course, in sociology, we always say, well, what about the next generation? Right? What about their children? Right? Because at the same time as they're bringing these languages, their children are learning English and becoming increasingly American and not as connected, we see from data, with the home community or the home village. So that leads us, to the extent that many of these languages will continue in New York, it sort of requires continued immigration, right? It would seem. Or some conscious attempt, yes, among some of the second generation, but that's not as likely, right? That may continue it to some degree, but really the question is if the next generation is sort of losing the language or not using it very much, or just to speak to their parents, and then by the third generation. So we have that going on, but also we have continued immigration coming into New York. And that's what I guess I wanted in the conclusion of your book. And actually, you sort of alluded to this in their introductory remarks. You give, I don't know if I want to call it pessimistic, but a view of the future in terms of immigration, in which you write that the expansive era of post-1965 immigration, which came about because of the 1965 Immigration Act, which eliminated national origin quotas, may be coming to a close in the Trump and post-Trump era. And let me just put forward a few, and then you can respond by talking about your views. So far, we have seen continued high figures of annual admissions of lawful permanent residents, so what some people would call legal immigrants, okay? Even during the pandemic. In 2021, 7 million came or admitted, not they didn't come, they were admitted as lawful permanent residents. The year before, it was, over 700,000. The total immigrant population in the country is now 46 million, which is up by about 1 million since 2021. So we've seen increased immigration, actually. Yes, I agree there will be political pressures from Republicans to cut back on immigration if Trump comes into power. But other factors, I think, are likely to lead to a continuation of large numbers. The aging of the population, the baby boomers, by 2030, all of them will be 65 and older. It was a very large cohort. They're going to be leaving the workforce. And they're very low they're low fertility rates, and not way below replacement level now, plus a demand from employers for workers, both low skilled and high skilled. So even if there are cutbacks in lawful permanent residents, I think we're likely to see at least several 100,000 immigrants being admitted as lawful permanent residents a year, as well as legal temporary workers in programs, which we know often lead to permanent immigration. So myself, maybe there'll be cutbacks, yes. But I do see that there will be continued fairly high levels of immigration. So on that score, if that's correct, and of course we don't know, then we will see new immigrants coming in with their languages, adding to those who are already here, and so that the process will continue. Or I guess, I mean, you could say if it's cut off, then that's less likely. But I know I'm going to hand it over to you now to talk about your other, another possibility for the future, if that's what
New York has always depended on what I call the great replenishment. And literally demographically, if you look at the role of New York as a gateway, and it's true of other cities too, but New York par excellence, we, keep our population or grow basically through net international in-migration, people coming here, and then people leave domestically. So because of cost of living and other things. And of course, that might be the same person. Many immigrants will come for a few years and then go somewhere else, or their kids will go somewhere else. But basically, for our population not to drop precipitously, we, as a city, have long depended basically on immigration from outside. Of course, there's some domestic in-migration of people, who want to come here from elsewhere, but it's not substantial compared to international immigration that comes here. So we need that. We've depended on that, and I think immigrants have played a historic role in maintaining and revitalizing American cities, there's a huge amount to be said about that. Linguistically speaking, there's also a lot of complicated developments. One is that languages are becoming more endangered back home. National languages are on the march everywhere. And so people are less likely now to bring distinct languages. They're more likely perhaps already to be speaking English or to be speaking a larger national language. Migration often is also multi-step. So people may often move to a capital city or a larger place where a language shift is already a factor. And so again, the chances of them bringing a different language here and of that opportunity to sort of enrich New York with everything that a language has in it, and the opportunity as linguists to work with speakers and to develop languages here, that may all be diminishing. So what I speculate or talk about in the conclusion is this question of whether we're at peak linguistic diversity here, which might be different from continued immigration. But what I would note about the politicization of immigration, which I think is in some ways unprecedented unless you go back to the early 1900s, which led to that sort of slamming shut of the door, arguably for all but Northern and Western Europeans. I think there are certainly, there are increasing levels of politicization where we could see, especially with Republicans in power, real threats to immigration as we know it. And one of the new, proposals is to make English language actually sort of part of a points-based system, such that actually, ability to speak English, and this dovetails with that sort of English-only movement and the feeling of the threat from Spanish in particular that Nancy mentioned, which many Republicans have championed in red states in particular, is that you could actually have people sort of who don't speak English. You could have things like language tests. You could have, that being a factor in immigration, so that actually linguistic diversity is sort of actively being filtered out. And if communities are being sort of choked off from continued immigration, as we said, they need that replenishment usually to maintain their languages in New York. On the other hand, there are examples like Hasidic Yiddish and other groups which are where New York is the future of the language. It could be true for Seke as well. For a number of languages, they depend on what's happening in New York. This is where the largest number of speakers are. This is the place where films can be made. This is the place where there is a platform for the language. So I want to be hopeful, but in terms of a linguistic infrastructure, this is something else I talk about in the book. What are we doing? Do we even recognize or know that these languages are here? What access is there to translation and interpretation? To what extent are we sort of creating an atmosphere where there's bilingual education? Certainly it's increased, and there's a lot of momentum around being a more truly multilingual city that embraces it, is not just sort of passively receiving it. It's a big question mark. So I'm glad to hear. I totally agree about the sort of demographic need for immigration. I think what's going on is a planetary it's a planetary demographic fact where there are so many people, just as there were in the 19th century from Europe, which was bursting at the seams. There are now from Asia, Latin America, and Africa in particular, who for various reasons are impelled to migrate. There's a historic opportunity in terms of the skills that people have, in terms of our own demographic decline. There is a real match there, but I fear that even in New York itself, with the current migrant crisis, the way that it's unfolding, there's a chance that the sort of traditionally unshakable kind of pro-immigrant politics of New York, given that so many of us are all immigrants or children of immigrants or grandchildren of immigrants, even that is potentially could be shaken. If the way that it plays out and the way that it's framed and the way that it's understood is if there's fear. I think 1924 shows us what could happen on the 100th anniversary of that it's possible that this idea, it's just going to be more and more global and diverse and interesting, and we'll have more restaurants and music and people and languages here. I wish I could be that hopeful, but I feel like things can go any number of ways, and we need to sort of hear the city in all of its languages now, and try to appreciate it and understand it, because we still are just kind of only barely grasping what's even here now.
I'm glad to hear you talk about the global picture, though, in terms of the global push for English becoming the global language of business, of academics, of money. I mean, I think that's also having an effect, right? And many immigrants, unlike in the past, come to New York already speaking English. I mean,
already Americanized in certain ways.
Fluent in English. I mean, already. So that's a big change from the past. Yeah. But I agree. We don't know what's going to happen yet in New York. And of course, a lot depends on local politics too. We're seeing things with our current mayor. We don't know that that's going to be true under another administration. So,
right.
So we'll have to see. I mean, New York is still a very blue city in a blue state.
Yes, and it's fundamentally, it's hard to,
with many immigrants and children of immigrants who vote. So given that there are 3 million immigrants in New York, over a little more than 3 million, and with their children, they're about 60%. And so they're a big part of the electorate increasingly. So that we don't really know how that will play out, but it's good to hear your to get some take on what might happen, and also to hear about languages. So I'm sure people, it's a wonderful story that, well, not story, but sensitivity that you have, and to how important that is to know.
Thank you, Nancy. I mean, I should say also that, just briefly, and I think we're going to go to questions, but obviously English is a crucial lingua franca in the city. I also talk about New York City English, which itself is very much bound up with the story of immigrants in a complex way. There are many Englishes here as well, many English Creoles, but also varieties of English. This is a world capital of those. So there's the question here is just whether there needs to be a sort of dominant mother tongue, and whether that even really, a lingua franca certainly can ease daily life and business and whatever, and English can play that role, but also deeply rooted and deeply felt identities, I think, have a strong place, not even to get into what the languages themselves kind of hold and carry. So I think there's a multilingual balance that New York on its best days can strike. And part of what I also try to talk about towards the close is, what life is just like on a regular day in Queens, where, in many places people are speaking 4, 5, 6 languages. There's many different communities, but people basically are getting along. And some people will sometimes say to me, "Oh, well, if we all spoke English, it would all be peaceful and we would all get along." Well, clearly not the case from observing how English speakers interact with each other sometimes, or the political divides in our country. Whereas actually, to see how different groups coexist and manage across different languages, whether English is the lingua franca or Bengali or Spanish or so on, or multilingualism, I think there's something actually that contemporary Queens especially really has to teach us, but really New York as a whole and New York's history as this American Babel. So anyway, I look forward to the questions, and thank you so much, Nancy, for yours and for this discussion.
All right, that's my cue. We have 35 minutes. I'm sorry, 25 minutes for 20 questions. I hesitate to invite more, but if you do have some questions, now is the time to get them in. Let's see how quickly we can go through this. Lou Ensler asks, does the fact that more immigrants come here already speaking some English make it likelier that their children and grandchildren will retain their indigenous language since there's they're already somewhat assimilated, or is it was the contrary there?
Excuse me. Well, sorry, that raises an interesting question actually about the sort of generational story which we were talking about. There is something that has been described as sort of third generation return, which is this sort of an interest that maybe is tied with a wider interest in sort of roots and kind of ethnic revival, which has been noted since the 1970s in particular, where perhaps as maybe your question is suggesting, that once there is a sort of comfort level, whether it's in English or in American society, it actually allows for more room to explore those roots, to revitalize a language, to maintain a language. I mean, languages, the way we study them in sociolinguistics, they have different spheres of use, and multilingualism is not random, it's patterned. You can very much have a sort of one language for the home, one language for the street, one language for school, one language for religion. And again, it doesn't take any special training. It's multilingualism has been a historic fact of most of the world for as much history as we know. So I think at its best, ideally perhaps English and we see this in certain parts of the world, whether it's in South India where the sort of knowledge of English and the use of English actually has been used in some ways as a protection for South Indian languages to say, well, we don't need to assimilate to Hindi. We can meet you on the sort of more neutral terrain of English. This is one sort of take on this, while also maintaining Tamil or Malayalam and so on. So I think actually this is a way in which a lingua franca can play a positive role. If that's, hopefully that gets at the question.
Yeah. Elsa Brunswick writes, since it seems to be that marginalized people are likelier to immigrate, do you think they're also likelier to preserve their language of origin, as seems to be the case with Yiddish and other communities?
So yeah, in terms of this question of the more marginalized immigrating, it is a complex story, and I wanted to say I also kind of I take Nancy's point that there is also elite migration in some cases. There is also there certainly of the well-educated and so on. It could be, in some cases it might be that somebody's from an ethno-linguistic minority, but actually in terms of their class background is a little bit higher. Certainly in many cases, it's not the poorest who can necessarily afford to migrate. It's those who have some access to resources and networks. But I still think there is a strong, for whatever set of reasons, overrepresentation of ethno-linguistic minorities and arguably of religious minorities and others as well, compared to others. So, in terms of some of them, I think will strongly, there is a strong identity and a desire to hold on to a language that will be maybe true both in the home region and here. In other cases, the pressure is overwhelming. And then there may be communities feel very differently about linguistic identity, and even individuals within communities. If we take the case of Irish, for instance, I think there's a full sense for many Irish New Yorkers that I've talked to about this, that you can certainly be very Irish without speaking Irish. Nonetheless, nobody would deny that the Irish language is a deep part of Irish identity. What happened there is that centuries of pressure to shift to English through English colonialism in Ireland really have pushed the language to the brink, to where it was highly endangered. A new kind of Irish English has emerged, which itself is arguably a badge of Irish identity. New York, as a major Irish diaspora capital, also has pretty serious Irish language movement and a strong, important history of that. In terms of some of the freedoms that New York can actually allow through sort of laissez-faire, being outside of certain political pressures, the very first Irish language periodical in the world was printed here in Brooklyn a year before anything was printed in Dublin, where there were sort of more negative pressures. So Irish has been able to sort of, you know, to play a role here. So I think it's, you know, every group, there are sort of different views on the role that language plays. Some communities are less concerned about language loss. Certainly there, you know, practical concerns are always to the fore, livelihood, shelter, and so on. But many communities in New York, you know, we're in some ways in a golden age of language revitalization, and we have so many people coming to us here at the Endangered Language Alliance, wanting in various ways to support their language, teach their language. The city is full of community language classes where, outside of any traditional schools, the various hometown associations and other local institutions are, the community themselves are trying to pass on and teach the language. So it varies, but there are a lot of efforts going on.
Maybe can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Sure.
I think we have to be very careful, though, when we say that, you know, most of the immigrants coming are marginalized, because actually most of the immigrants coming today are not marginalized in their home country. As I do want to emphasize that. I mean, the literature shows over and over they're a selected group. They have higher status than many of those who remain. And certain groups, Asians, you know, many of the largest groups of immigrants coming to the United States are of Indians, Chinese. They have a high proportion are highly educated. 80% of Indian immigrants have a BA or higher. 80%. 30% of Americans have a BA or, you know, native born Americans. I mean, they're much more highly educated. They're hyper selected. You know, Chinese, Filipinos, over 50% have a BA or higher. So we're talking about a lot of immigrant groups, you know, and large percentage of immigrants, and that's becoming, as there's been more Asian immigration there in recent years, that a large proportion do have fairly high levels of education. So, you know, we're not getting the worst, you know, maybe people are sometimes thinking of refugees, right, who are coming and fleeing political violence, but most immigrants are not refugees.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a relatively small proportion. And the same thing with asylees. We're experiencing very few people get asylum, right? So, I mean, I think that that it's, you know, we need to think that it's
a diverse
change our
group.
picture a little bit of immigration, and that's
Mhm.
true to New York, and so it's. And I also think we should say, I know it's important clearly, and that I can see this the impetus to want to maintain some home country languages, even among the third generation, and a pride in their origins. But we also have to think about how important it is. I do have to say, learning English, if you're going to make it in America, and many immigrants come here because they want to do better. They want their children to do better. They want to move up. That's why they've come here, because things are better here economically, they believe, for themselves and their children. And to do that, they really do have to learn English and be fluent in English. And so, I mean, there are the pressures there too. So I just want to I mean, there's somehow,
I don't think
I'm
there's
sure
any,
you agree with all that, but I just want
I
somehow,
don't think there's any issue with,
no,
there's tons of free classes to learn English. The city sponsors it.
well, it doesn't. It doesn't
There's-
have as much as it should, but
it's there's more money for that than, just that one thing is more money than there is
well, there is
all
a
the languages
criticism and a
combined.
concern that there's not enough language classes for immigrants who would like to learn. But I think that that's important to keep in mind when we're just thinking about, okay.
Okay, so we've got a very linguisty type of question next. Mike R. When assisting in the development of writing systems for exclusively oral languages, Ross, is there a tendency to use extant alphabets, or rather the creation of new character systems to represent sounds unique to the language?
I'm glad you asked that, because there is a portrait of somebody named Ibrahima, who I've known for several years, who's from Guinea, who's come to New York, and is promoting a relatively new writing system called encode, which is a new character system created in the 1940s. And West Africa has actually been a sort of hotbed of these new writing systems in the last 200 years. So there are cases like that. Each one is extraordinary, and I think, you know, I kind of try to give a close-up description of how this writing system encode emerged, which was not really linguists involved exactly, but linguists would certainly say it's impressive how it marks tone, and it really sort of marks things about these particular languages, whereas using Latin writing or Arabic writing with some of the alternatives have not. So, generally speaking, people will adapt existing writing systems, and linguists, we have our International Phonetic Alphabet, which is a sort of periodic table for the world's sounds. I talked about this a little bit. It's not particularly user-friendly, so it's not something that people would necessarily want to write in a lot, but some of its characters can be used. But there's overall a tendency probably to adapt Latin-based character systems because of the convenience, especially now with technology and keyboards. But there are different cases of new character systems that are iconic, and certainly that those are an interesting story as well, and different combinations.
Annie Hawk, hi Annie, writes, what about New York City accents? The language and sound of the New York City accent, iconic Brooklyn and Bronx accents, for example. How do they fit in your work in terms of inclusion and recognition?
I talk about it a little bit in the book. It's not, I'm not a scholar. I'm not a scholar of New York City English or Englishes. It's certainly tied up with the history of immigration. It's certainly a fascinating dimension of the city's history that such a powerful and wealthy city overall has quite a stigmatized reputation linguistically in terms of its variety. This is totally different from the English spoken in London. Well, we could talk about Cockney, the class basis. But in terms of Southeastern forms of English, Southeastern England, or Parisian French or Beijing Mandarin, usually the largest and wealthiest city, which is usually also the capital in many cases, has a sort of prestigious accent for the most part, except for some working class exceptions. New York is kind of at variance from that, and I think it partly has to do with this sort of stigma that New York is not quite American, that it is sort of stigmatized by its kind of immigrant taint. There have been moments where New York has been positioned more effectively as American, but it doesn't sort of last. And I think it's not surprising that sort of the higher prestige forms of English basically are kind of associated with other places. I think the question of what happens to New York City English now, which it also can really be described more in terms of ethnic differences as well, ethnolects, as linguists call it. So there are certain shared things, but really there is a sort of, New York City Jewish English, Italian English, African-American English. Those have to be differentiated a little bit. It's not clear that they actually break down differently by borough, much as we might kind of want that or think that would be interesting. But, it is a feature of sort of deep local distinctiveness. It is a part of our linguistic history. Its future is also in doubt through this sort of flattening. Although I should say that the English is in some ways probably being sustained now more by immigrants or the children of immigrants and others who actually will adapt that first. So it's a complex story that we treat a little bit, but.
Well, I should say that the Gotham Center did have a fascinating conversation with someone who did focus exclusively on this question a couple of years ago. It should be on our YouTube channel if anyone.
Michael Newman, or
pardon?
Michael Newman. He's one linguist who's Queens College.
This was with a scholar out at one of the universities in Long Island. I've been trying to remember the name of the book while you were chatting, and I can't. But Annie, if you want, or anybody else is interested, you can send me a note and I'll get it to you. Hannah Vasilianik writes, 60 years ago, Latin was the lingua franca of the Roman Catholic Church. It was considered a dead language when I studied it in high school. Is it even more dead today?
I don't know. Latin, I mean, I studied Latin for many years. I love Latin. Latin has had a curious long afterlife, and many languages that become liturgical languages. Latin, of course, is bound up with the Catholic Church. It's also it survived as a language of scholarship and diplomacy and other things into, the 18th century in Europe. Of course, the Vatican II conference, where the Catholic Church sort of opened up to vernacular languages beyond Latin, had an impact. But I've been I checked out a Latin Mass here in Manhattan. There is a movement around the Latin Mass. There is a spoken Latin movement as well among classicists who are trying to sort of not just keep up the study of Latin, but actually use it and give it sort of life. So I don't know if it can really be called a dead language, or really what the languages don't necessarily sort of die and are born in the ways that we might think of humans or species, but have more complex lives to them, especially if it's as well documented a language as Latin, where it can have a sort of continuing afterlife and continuing resonances and uses. A lot of our concern and what we work on is about documenting languages that have no documentation, so that if speakers choose, they can sort of turn back to it. They can use it, whether it's in symbolic ways or vernacular daily life ways, that record is there. So if there is, a body of work, as there is with Latin, a body of material, a language can go on in all kinds of different ways, and people can determine creative linguistic futures. Again, I think nobody's concerned. I mean, I'm sure there is concern about English, but really, the vast majority of people are learning it. There's tons of material. There's endless amounts of money around it. So the concern here is, like, can there be a little attention for languages that nobody is even talking about?
Maybe if we make Lenape the business language. Jessica B says, I really appreciate ELA's work, the Endangered Language Alliance, and I'm so glad the organization exists. I think you maybe even failed to mention this, the ELA, the organization that you co-direct, is the only language devoted to this purpose in any city. Is that right? You've
The only
listed
organization
all those lines.
that's focused on urban linguistic diversity.
Yeah.
So this idea that languages are in cities today, that's where linguistic diversity is. That's our focus.
So everyone should go out and check out their website and make donations right now. And Jessica continues, I find all this fascinating. Look forward to reading your book. I wonder if it makes sense to keep languages alive. I'm sorry. I wonder if it makes sense to try to preserve and keep languages alive in a diaspora with very few speakers. For a language to flourish and continue, it seems like a language can only flourish and continue when there are enough speakers, enough people in the community that speak the language. In other words, that a diaspora is only promising when there's a critical mass.
A critical mass is important, for sure. There are a number of languages that we work on where there may only be one or a few speakers here, and for them, it's a language of the telephone. It's a language they're using with a relative back home or a friend on the other side of the world. And certainly, that it's not going to make sense to try to teach the language, or to, it's not going to be used so much in daily life. Again, I should say that, I'm not just sort of here as an advocate for these languages. This is a linguistic history of New York. It's the stories of people. You can also find a lot of material about larger languages in there and the roles they've played in the history of the city, and the present day of the city. So, yeah, it's you do need a critical mass in terms of it's true in terms of maintaining a language.
Well, this is a bit of a follow-up on some of the things we've been talking about already, but to the question of generations, and maybe Nancy, I'm not sure if it was mentioned before, this notion of the cycle. Does that still sort of maintain? How important are the I mean, you've sort of iterated on this already, so if you want us to move on, we can move on. But how important is access to the home country and access to that community's language?
For what? For maintaining
the
language?
Languages. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think what Ross was saying, there's a bunch of different factors. So I guess you can have some operating and not all, Yeah, I think it helps if there's a home community that people are maintaining relations with. But also, if there are enough speakers, if someone had just asked the question, if there are enough people in the city who form a community, and a lot of people are speaking the language, it's used at places of worship, it's used in other community organizations, then there's a tendency, obviously, that's going to support the continuation of the language at the same time as the people are going to be learning English, or in some cases, Spanish. Because, there are so many Spanish speakers in New York City and in the country at large. So, both things can be going on at the same time. Yeah, I mean, as we said, that's talking about immigrants. The children of immigrants are another issue, partly because they were born here, right? They're much more integrated into American institutions on the whole. They're more likely, by the way, to intermarry or to have relations with people, not just outside their linguistic group, but outside of their national origin group or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of intermarriage. And by the third generation, I mean, that's why I meant by, the intergenerational progression of linguistic assimilation. Yeah, I know.
Do you want, Peter, to try to just kind of go quickly through some of the remaining questions?
I don't think we're gonna. If you want to try,
try to do a really.
I do remember you were quite last time we did one of these. You were quite efficient. So if you want to take a whack,
try very quickly. I won't sort of get to anything. I think to everything, unfortunately. Question here about Jewish languages beyond Yiddish. I think it's important to mention that the whole linguistic diversity of the Jewish diaspora is here. Ladino, crucially, also known as Judeo-Spanish. There's a question about. I talk about just how substantial that community was here as well in the book, in many different neighborhoods, a flourishing press, all kinds of things, as well as forms of Judeo-Arabic, Juhuri, the language of the Jews of Azerbaijan, forms of Jewish Neo-Aramaic, and so on. So, again, some of this is more historical, but then there are also kind of strong and fascinating movements, as in recent years with Ladino, to revive it and to use it in various ways. YIVO is certainly an example of secular Yiddish kind of still in action. Olivia's question about sort of top-down versus bottom-up representation, the visibility of languages in public space. There's, again, the census doesn't even capture most of these languages, only a fraction of them. The city provides some kind of support in 10 of them. The primarily oral languages are not going to really have signage and so on, so they're not going to be visible in a certain way. So linguistic diversity really has to be sort of oral, and I hope the book sort of opens that up and brings it into earshot. In terms of what to do, I hope that the sort of future chapter of the book kind of gives some ideas about ways that we could help with language access and language barriers. We can certainly, I don't know so much, the example of Japan, I think, is mentioned in terms of immigration, but there's all kinds of places that we could look to in terms of language policy and multilingualism. Cities which do support, having many different languages, and it enriches them ultimately. Tomonori asks about sort of legal obligations for language access. There are these executive orders. ASL is a fascinating example, a distinctive language. This is not just signed English, but crucial in the deaf community. And of course, there's all kinds of support for ASL in certain ways. So there's a lot that could be done in terms of more resources. The health department resources that I mentioned. We hosted sort of COVID-related webinar community events in I think 16 different languages, but have been focusing on half a dozen indigenous languages of the Americas, like Mam and Quiche from Guatemala. Mixtec from Mexico, Quechua from Ecuador, Garifuna we mentioned from Central America. Many questions. Ken Lowe, who is on the front lines of this with Moya actually and language access, tell us a lot more how to foster more fluid and sustainable multilingualisms. There needs to be more spaces, more opportunities. It's a long and complex kind of question, but I think by valuing these languages more, by even having more events, more spaces, more open celebration of them, a lot can be done. Sorry that was very kind of abbreviated. I know we're running out of time, but I hope we can sort of continue the conversation. Please drop me a line. My email is out there. Tell me what you think of the book. Let's keep talking. But Peter.
Book is Language Cities. Oh, there we go. Language City. The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York. And you can find Ross at rossperlin.org, correct?
.com,
.com, and the Endangered Languages at endangeredlanguagesalliance.org.
EL Alliance. Yeah, I can put those in the chat, but yeah, if you Google us or look us up.
Use your
find
Google, folks, and go out and buy the
Yeah.
book immediately. It is definitely worth it. The Gotham Center's own Mike Wallace raves, astonishing, fascinating, revelating, exhilarating, beautifully written, clearly organized, powerfully argued, and I fully agree. Ross, we're so proud that we could have a part in making this book, and we wish you all the best success. The views have been coming in. They love it. They should. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for watching this evening. We hope you will come back and visit us again at our next book talk.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.